Most national champions we've gotten in college football have been the cream of the crop of the sport. True juggernauts that we can undoubtedly call some of the greatest college football teams ever assembled. Even though they can hold the title of champs forever, the teams that don't go undefeated and still manage to win the Natty typically have a blemish or two on their resume, and some of their losses come from other really great teams, or you can understand where a loss like that might occur even if they were the superior team. But we've got national champions who suffered losses during the regular season to teams that weren't even close to being elite, that raise the eyebrow and keeps you believing in the underdog. My name is Caleb, and as the college football season wrapped up over the past week, we got a national championship game that featured two great teams that suffered some of the biggest upsets, arguably in their program's histories during the regular season. Unranked NIU walked into South Bend and beat Notre Dame all the way back in week 2, and Michigan, having a down year after winning the Natty last year and losing tons of personnel, including Jim Harbaugh, to the NFL, walked into Columbus and beat the future champion Buckeyes during rivalry week. And even though these losses may not have ended up mattering to their national championship hopes in the grand scheme of things, it's still so interesting in hindsight seeing future national champions be upset by teams during the regular season that would otherwise be marked as a W when schedules were rolled out. Today, I want to go through a few national championship teams since 2000 that were upset during the regular season by some of the biggest underdogs on their schedule that year. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this, and with that being said, let's jump in. Since 2000, the LSU Tigers have managed to win 3 national titles against pretty respectable opponents in the title game, and in each national title game, they were favored to win, except for their 2003 matchup against Oklahoma. OU had a slightly tougher schedule that year and was the #1 team in the country almost wire to wire, and they'd meet the Tigers in the Sugar Bowl that year for the national championship game, where they were stunned in a 21-14 slugfest as Saban's squad would end up holding the coveted Crystal Coaches Trophy to end the night. At the time, this team was kind of controversially selected for the national championship game over USC, who was ranked #1 at the end of the regular season, but the BCS computer system decided otherwise. The most notable reason for this controversy, and the reason that most would have kept LSU out of the championship game, was their only loss of the season, a 12-point home loss to unranked Florida. LSU was the #6 ranked team in the country during this loss, and knocked them all the way down to 10 before they'd run the table and win out the rest of their schedule. But it was one of the more interesting losses a future national champion would have in recent memory. They were shut out in the final 3 quarters of the game after scoring their only 7 points in the first frame on a punt return touchdown by Skylar Green. Florida would shut down this LSU offense that had weapons like Michael Clayton, Devery Henderson, and a backfield led by Joseph Adai and Justin Vincent. And even their 2007 national championship team, while not as good personnel-wise as the 03 team, ended up suffering a couple losses during the season that were a tad bit more reasonable, but they were still upsets. The SEC in the late 2000s were insanely stacked, and in 07, LSU was once again the premier school from that conference headed into that year. They were ranked 2nd in the country and had the 3rd toughest schedule. It was going to be a gauntlet, but they were going to be favored in almost every game they played. Their first loss of the season was to a 17th ranked Kentucky squad in a game where Stevie Johnson had 7 catches for 134 yards and a touchdown in a triple overtime thriller. The Tigers were favored, but that wasn't too bad of a loss, all things considered. They would bounce back, and by the time of their November 23rd matchup against Arkansas, they were the #1 team in the country. The Razorbacks entered Death Valley as a pretty big underdog, but would pull out all the stops to push the Tigers over the edge in, ironically, another triple overtime loss, this time at home. It was maybe the most iconic game of the underrated Darren McFadden's career at Arkansas, where he'd have over 230 total yards and 4 touchdowns. But LSU would get the last laugh and claw their way to the BCS National Championship again, but would become the first 2-loss champion of the BCS era. The SEC was extremely deep again in 2008, but this time, it was the Florida Gators who entered the year as one of the conference favorites, led by Heisman Trophy winner Tim Tebow. The 08 Gators is widely considered to be one of the greatest college football teams of all time, as so much of their roster ended up in the NFL at some point for various lengths of time. The team won the 2008 National Championship after one of the most dominant stretches of wins in recent memory, but their one loss during the regular season is what most likely motivated them to get to the mountaintop. Week 5, in Gainesville, the 4th-ranked Gators were taking on unranked Ole Miss in an early season SEC matchup. The Rebels were 2-2 coming into that game, but had a pretty solid roster all things considered. But Florida was going to dominate, right? Ole Miss stunned the college football world by walking into the swamp and grabbing a 31-30 win on the road after 3 Florida lost fumbles proved to be costly. It was this game that inspired the Tebow speech apologizing to the Gators fans for not coming through on an undefeated season, but promised that a lot of good would come out of the loss, which they'd follow through on months later. There would be a few years that would go by where the national champions didn't suffer any all-time upsets while cementing themselves in college football immortality. But as we get to the college football playoff era just a couple years later, the 2014 Ohio State Buckeyes would usher in a new era with a championship, their first one since the 14-0 2002 team under head coach Jim Tressel. Like that team, the 2014 squad would also win 14 games, but unlike the 02 squad, would have an upset loss on their record. Let's go back to early in the 2014 season where Ohio State had the most stacked team in the Big Ten that year. Plenty of recognizable names if you're an NFL fan, even more if you love college football too. And they'd start the season with a respectable ranking as the 5th best team in the country and would start their season with a win over a solid Navy team. And come week 2, they'd be in prime time in the shoe to take on the Virginia Tech Hokies. Though they'd fall to 8th in the rankings, they were expected to take care of their unranked ACC opponent pretty handily. But the Hokies came out and absolutely punched the Buckeyes in the mouth after taking a 21-7 lead in the first half and kept control of the game the rest of the way, edging out a 14-point ranked win on the road. The Buckeyes would fall all the way to the 22nd ranked team in the country, but they'd follow it up with an undefeated rest of the season where they'd build their CFP resume with wins against teams like a top 10 Michigan State and a 59-0 shutout of Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship game, all their way to the national championship. And though their loss against Virginia Tech was the only blemish on their record that year, they'd get revenge the following year in Blacksburg in a 14-point win of their own during Labor Day weekend. The 2015 season and the second year of the CFP would see the first college football playoff title for Alabama in the Nick Saban era, and even though they'd go 14-1 and avoid any major upsets, number 15 Ole Miss was able to knock them off in Tuscaloosa in week 3. This was one of the more stacked Saban-Bama teams, but 2015 Ole Miss wasn't half bad either. They finished 10-3 and won the Sugar Bowl, so a fairly respectable loss for the future national champions. Let's fast forward to 2016 though. We'd have our first CFP champions from the ACC with Clemson, their first chip in a good 35 years. This year gave us one of the best championship games to date, as the Tigers would walk it off with a Hunter Renfrow touchdown just before time expired against Bama. Throughout the year, Clemson was the best team in the ACC, never dropping below the 5th team in the country, peaking as high as number 2, where they'd be at during their home matchup against Pitt on November 12th of that season. The Tigers were 9-0 and against an unranked Pitt team at home. This was just going to be another ACC win in the W column just a few weeks before the ACC championship game. But the Panthers really wanted to play spoiler. In an unexpected thriller, Pitt would pull out all the stops in a back-and-forth classic to get a 43-42 one-point win. James Conner's 132 yards on 2 touchdowns on the ground, and Nathan Peterman's 5 touchdown passes shocked the Clemson fan base in what was shaping up to be a perfect season before the Panthers played spoiler. We had yet to get an undefeated CFP champion by 2016, but if Alabama had made their goal line stand against Clemson, we would have gotten one fairly quickly. The 2017 team would try to put themselves into a position to get to that coveted undefeated season, but again would have just one loss on their resume before getting to their 3rd straight national title game. And it hits different when the only loss is to a rival, but not just any rival, the rival. The 2017 national champion Crimson Tide's only loss that year was against number 6 Auburn in the Iron Bowl, but like some of the previous teams in our video, this loss wasn't going to hurt them too much playoff wise. We all know the rivalry runs deeper than sports, so even though they did get the natty, I know they still wanted that win over Auburn that season. The CFP would see a string of undefeated champions over the next few years though, with 4 of the next 5 champions finding themselves in that exclusive club. Aside from the 2021 Georgia team, who had an SEC championship loss to top 3 Alabama as their only loss of the year, undefeated champions were kind of becoming the norm in the CFP era. In 2024, we saw the first year of the 12-team era, and with more teams, there's going to be more of a chance of another non-undefeated champion, but that still shouldn't take away from how hard it is to win a championship in college football. And as mentioned in the intro, we had the 2 national title finalists suffer some of the biggest upsets in recent memory for teams of that caliber. Should Notre Dame have won the title this season? I think that NIU would have a real case of being the most unlikely team ever to beat a future national champion, as since 2000 they would have been the only non-power school to accomplish that feat. But history would go the other way, and Ryan Day and Ohio State would get over the hump to win the latest national championship in college football. And while their first loss of the season on the road to Big Ten newcomer Oregon gave us a mid-season classic, their second loss is the one that I want to touch on in this video. The team up north, as Buckeye fans refer to them as, would come into Columbus and swipe their Big Ten title hopes away in an absolute slugfest. This maybe had some of the most storylines coming into a Michigan-Ohio State game in recent memory, despite Michigan's relative down year and Ohio State's national title hopes. Since becoming coach at OSU, Ryan Day hadn't beat Michigan since 2019, and this was the year where they could have more than likely steamrolled them and gave bragging rights back to the Buckeyes, but they couldn't recover from a sluggish start, and it was more of the same of what it had been in the previous few years. And I know that Ohio State fans will take a national championship over a regular season win because that's the ultimate goal. But to have the lowest moment of a championship year come in arguably the biggest rivalry game in the sport has gotta sting, but a ring makes it hurt just a tad less. And that goes for every team we mentioned today, and the ones we didn't. Having a regular season loss to an inferior team shouldn't put a damper on a championship season, but it'll always be so interesting to go back and see how these juggernauts with future pros at most positions on the field ended up dropping those 1 or 2 games that make you scratch your head a little bit. And for the teams who slayed Goliath, I know it's just another regular season win in the grand scheme of things, but it's still gotta be pretty cool to say you were one of the only teams to figure out and beat a future national champion. Let me know in the comments who you think the most memorable team to take down a future national champion is, and how you remember seeing some of those games play out. My name is Caleb. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.